train to hell. Rai, he had once been a professional thief. No matter where he was, he could carry out his actions smoothly. That day, the location was the subway, and it was also where he would pay a heavy price for his sins. While fleeing from pursuit, Rai boarded a subway train that looked quite old, carrying the scent of damp concrete, rust, and something faintly metallic, almost like the smell of blood. The subway car was nearly empty, except for a few scattered passengers in various cars. Most of them seemed lost in their own worlds. One was dozing off, another absorbed in their phone. But then, at the far end of the car, there was an older man who looked quite terrifying. He wore a long, dark coat, his face obscured by shadows, but his eyes were cold and piercing, chillingly sharp. Rai tried to shake off the discomfort, shifting in his seat, looking elsewhere. But the feeling of always being watched made him very alert. The subway suddenly jolted, the lights flickering more violently before dimming to a weak, pale yellow. The train began to slow down, the sound of the brakes screeching like a high-pitched wail echoing through the thief's skull. He glanced around, noticing that the other passengers had disappeared, leaving only him and the mysterious man at the end of the car. He tried to stand up, move toward the exit, but his legs were stiff. The man in the dark coat began to stand up, moving toward him with slow, deliberate steps, his eyes never leaving the thief. The subway train came to a complete stop. The doors remained closed. The thief was trapped. The man approached the thief, raising one hand with fingers unusually long and thin, and waved it slowly in front of the thief's face. The thief's eyes glazed over, his mind succumbing to the invisible power of hypnosis. His body went limp, collapsing into the seat as he was pulled into a vision, deeper and deeper, until the subway car completely vanished. Rai found himself standing in a nightmarish version of a subway station. The walls were cracked and oozing a thick black substance, the lights flickering. The tracks were covered in a dense, glowing red fog that seemed to rise from the very depths of the earth, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. The thief staggered forward, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he looked around, trying to find a way out. But the exits were blocked, sealed shut by heavy iron gates covered in chains and padlocks that had mysteriously appeared. A moment later, he suddenly saw a reflection in the glass, a reflection of himself, but with his coat tattered and scorched, his face pale and gaunt, with hollow, sunken eyes. His lips twisted into a grotesque, terrifying smile. Scenes of his past crimes played out before him, distorted and twisted into horrific images of suffering and despair. In one scene, he watched himself pickpocketing a man on the subway, but this time, the man turned to him, his face melting away to reveal a skull with eyes burning with fire. The skeletal figure grabbed the thief's wrist, pulling him into the darkness where the sound of screams echoed. Next, another vision unfolded. Rai broke into an apartment, and suddenly, the floor beneath him collapsed. He fell into a pit filled with writhing hands, clawing at his flesh as they dragged him down, as if pulling him into hell. The images kept coming, each more horrifying than the last. Each vision was a punishment for the sins he had committed. He saw himself as one of the damned, trapped forever on this hellish train, riding the tracks of torment for all eternity. Inside the train, the thief was surrounded by the ghosts of his past victims. Their eyes burned with the fire of hatred. In his own eyes, the furnace roared with life, the flames growing hotter until they consumed everything. The thief was left in total darkness. The thief snapped back to reality, gasping for breath, his body drenched in sweat. He was back in the subway car. The man in the dark coat was gone, leaving only the sound of the train clattering on the tracks. Shaking, the thief staggered to his feet and exited the train. As he stepped onto the platform, he glanced back at the subway car. The train pulled away, the sound of its departure echoing through the empty station. The thief stood alone, the weight of his sins pressing down on him. Now he knew that there was no escaping the consequences, the punishment for his actions. Since that day, he has lived in darkness, plagued by agonizing headaches that feel like torture. He must live in fear, haunted by what he had seen and experienced. Perhaps this is just one of the punishments he has to endure. Horror Story Haunted Tracks. The legend of the haunted tracks had always been a topic of eerie fascination in our small town. The story went that, decades ago, a tragic train accident had occurred on the old, abandoned railway line just outside town. Many lives were lost that fateful night, and it was said that the spirits of the victims still lingered, haunting the area. As a skeptic, I never believed in ghosts or haunted places, but that changed one cold winter night. I was driving back home after visiting a friend when a heavy snowstorm hit, making the roads nearly impassable. I decided to take a shortcut through the old railway crossing, hoping to save some time. The wind howled, and snow fell in thick, blinding sheets as I navigated the narrow, winding road. The visibility was almost zero, and I had to slow down to a crawl. As I approached the old crossing, my car suddenly stalled. I tried to restart it, but the engine wouldn't turn over. Frustrated, I got out to check under the hood, the biting cold stinging my face and hands. As I fumbled with the engine, I heard a faint, distant whistle. I froze, remembering the tales of the haunted tracks. The whistle grew louder, and I saw a light piercing through the snowstorm, heading straight toward me. Panic set in as I realized it was an old steam train, barreling down the tracks at an alarming speed. I abandoned my car and tried to run, but the snow was too deep, and I stumbled. As the train approached, I could see it more clearly. A rusted, ancient locomotive, its windows shattered, and the metal twisted and scorched. I braced myself for the impact, but it never came. Instead, the train passed right through me, sending a bone-chilling cold through my body. I turned to see it continue down the tracks, disappearing into the storm. Shaking, I returned to my car and tried the engine again. This time, it roared to life, and I wasted no time getting back on the road, my heart pounding in my chest. When I finally reached home, I was too shaken to sleep. The next day, I told my friend Mark about the experience. Mark, a local history buff, was intrigued and suggested we investigate the site together. Armed with flashlights and a camera, we headed to the old railway crossing that evening. The storm had passed, leaving a calm, clear night. The tracks looked abandoned, covered in snow and rusted with age. As we walked along the line, Mark recounted the details of the accident. A collision between two trains due to a signaling error, killing dozens of passengers. Suddenly, we heard it again, the distant whistle. The air grew colder, and a light appeared down the tracks. We watched in disbelief as the same ghostly train emerged from the darkness, moving silently toward us. Mark, braver than I, stepped forward with his camera, snapping pictures. The train passed through us again, leaving us both shivering and breathless. When we reviewed the photos, we were stunned. In each shot, ghostly figures were visible, faces twisted in pain and fear, hands pressed against the windows as if pleading for help. We had captured the spirits of the victims, forever trapped on their final, tragic journey. The haunted tracks were no longer just a legend. They were a grim reminder of the lives lost and the restless souls that still wandered, seeking peace. I never took that shortcut again, and the memory of that night remained etched in my mind, a chilling testament to the power of the supernatural. The Yin and Yang Train. The Midnight Express was a train shrouded in mystery and fear. It was said to appear only once a year, on a stormy night, traveling through the remote countryside. Legend had it that those who boarded the train never returned. As a journalist for a local newspaper, I had always been skeptical of such tales, but I couldn't resist the lure of a good story. This year, I decided to investigate. It was a dark and stormy night, fitting for the task at hand. I drove to the old, abandoned train station where the Midnight Express was rumored to appear. The station was in disrepair, with weeds growing through the cracks in the platform and broken windows staring like empty eyes. The air was thick with anticipation and the distant rumble of thunder. I set up my camera and waited, the rain pouring down relentlessly. Just as I was beginning to doubt the legend, a distant whistle pierced the night. My heart raced as I saw the faint glow of the train's headlight approaching. The Midnight Express emerged from the darkness, an old steam engine with an eerie, almost spectral appearance. The train slowed to a halt, its doors creaking open. Despite my fear, I boarded the train, determined to uncover the truth. The interior was surprisingly well preserved, with plush seats and dim, flickering lights. The air inside was cold, and an unsettling silence hung over everything. I took a seat and prepared my notebook and camera, ready to document whatever I encountered. As the train began to move, I noticed that I was not alone. A few other passengers were scattered throughout the train, all of them staring straight ahead, their faces devoid of emotion. I tried to strike up a conversation with the man sitting across from me, but he remained silent, his eyes empty and hollow. A shiver ran down my spine. The train moved through the night, the storm raging outside. I decided to explore the other cars, hoping to find someone willing to talk. As I walked through the train, I noticed the passengers all had the same vacant expressions. They seemed more like mannequins than living people. My unease grew with each step. In the last car, I found a conductor. He was an old man with a weathered face and piercing eyes that seemed to see right through me.
Can I help you?
He asked, his voice gravelly and cold. I told him I was a journalist investigating the Midnight Express and asked about the passengers.
They are souls trapped between this world and the next. This train is their purgatory, a place where they must confront their past sins before moving on.
I felt a chill as I realized the gravity of his words. Why am I here? I asked. The conductor's eyes darkened.
You sought the truth, and now you are part of it. You must face your own demons before you can leave.
Panic set in as I tried to leave the car, but the door wouldn't budge. The train began to feel like a prison, the walls closing in on me. I ran back to my seat, hoping to find some way out. passengers' faces seemed to contort into grotesque masks, their eyes following my every move. Desperate, I looked out the window, but the landscape had changed. Instead of the familiar countryside, I saw scenes from my own life, moments of regret, guilt, and pain. The train was forcing me to confront my own past. As the storm outside intensified, so did my memories. I realized I had spent my life running from my mistakes, never facing the consequences of my actions. The train slowed to a stop, and the conductor appeared again.
"It's time,"
he said. With a deep breath, I stepped off the train and into the unknown, ready to confront my past and seek redemption. The Midnight Express disappeared into the night, leaving me alone on the platform, but no longer afraid. I had found my story, and it was one that I would carry with me forever. Stalker at the bus stop. A quiet and snowy Sunday evening. I was sitting at the bus stop, looking at my phone, and realized I had missed my bus. I started to shiver as the weather grew colder. Time passed slowly. I pulled out my phone again, put on my earphones, and selected a song to forget the uncomfortable cold. I looked around, realizing I was completely alone. No cars, no pedestrians, just an endless, empty street. Nearly an hour went by, and the bus was still nowhere in sight. I checked my phone again. The screen showed no updates on the bus's arrival, and the battery was dangerously low. A while later, I sensed some movement. A man wrapped in several layers of thick clothing, his face obscured by a knitted hood. The man walked with a strange, almost unsteady gait, as if he wasn't sure where he was going. I froze but tried to focus on my phone, not wanting to draw attention. The man approached the bus stop and sat at the opposite end of the bench. My discomfort grew. I glanced at the man, noticing part of his face exposed under the hood, a gaunt, pale face with eyes that seemed unfocused, distant. The man was muttering something to himself, his words slurred and incoherent. I shifted uncomfortably, sensing that something was off about this person. He moved closer, almost imperceptibly at first, but with each subtle shift, he inched toward me. My unease turned into panic as the man continued to slide closer, his gaze fixed on me in a strange, unsettling way. I felt a chill run down my spine. Suddenly, I felt the man's presence right next to me. The tension was unbearable. I quickly stood up, grabbed my bag, and started walking away from the bus stop. The man, still sitting there, tilted his head to the side, his eyes never leaving me as I walked away. I quickly walked away. I reached the next bus stop and finally felt somewhat relieved. I began to sit down slowly, letting my guard down a little as I waited for the bus. I closed my eyes for a moment, exhausted. The quiet of the falling snow was almost peaceful. Suddenly, a loud and rapid knock shattered the silence. My eyes shot open, my heart racing. I slowly turned around to see the man from the previous bus stop, standing on the other side of the glass, his face pressed against it, grinning maniacally. His eyes were wide, staring straight at me without blinking. He kept knocking on the glass, his breath fogging up the surface. Panic flooded my body. I quickly stood up and backed away from the glass. The man began moving, circling around, his gait more erratic than before. His footsteps grew closer. I backed away, yelling at the man to stay away. However, the man was undeterred. He raised his hand, reaching out as if to do something to me. Luckily, I reacted just in time, darting off the sidewalk as the man lunged toward me. In a strange, inexplicable way, he slipped forward, his face slamming hard into the cold, icy pavement. The sound was horrifying. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It was so bizarre. I watched in horror as blood began to pool around the man's face, staining the snow with a deep red. My mind raced as I tried to process what had just occurred. I crouched down, attempting to get a response from him, but there was none. I sat down on the curb, my hands trembling as I pulled out my phone and called for help. The snow continued to fall, turning this bus stop into a place of horror and dread for me. The flashing lights of the ambulance and police car pierced through the night. Paramedics rushed to the man's side, but it was clear that something was very wrong with him. As the paramedics searched the man's belongings, they found a photograph in his wallet, a picture of the man with a boy who looked eerily similar to me. The police explained that the man had been on prescription drugs after losing his son, and his mental state had deteriorated ever since. I realized, with disbelief, that the man may have mistaken me for his lost son. A few days later, I took my driving test. As I drove, I glanced down the road where the bus stop was in the distance, the events of that night still haunting me deeply. I couldn't shake the sorrow of the man's grief and the terrifying experience that had unfolded.
The curse of the top students. The school stood tall and intimidating with its Gothic architecture, old and worn, with ivy creeping up the walls. The atmosphere always felt gloomy. The walls were adorned with old portraits of past headmasters and notable students, their eyes seemingly following anyone who passed by. The floor creaked with every step. Elena, a studious girl in her late teens, was seated at a desk near the back of the classroom, immersed in a book. The room was empty except for her, and the silence was suffocating. The school had a bookshelf dedicated to the history and legends of the school over the years. It was quite large and sparked her curiosity to learn more. Elena searched through the archives, looking for information about a mysterious curse she had heard rumors about. While reading an old history book about the school's founding, she came across a leather-bound book, aged and ancient. Unexpectedly, a page with a paper bookmark revealed a section about the curse of the good and top students at the school. Years ago, the school had been plagued by a series of unexplained events. The top students began disappearing under mysterious circumstances, their academic excellence seemingly attracting a dark force. Shadows moved on their own, and strange whispers filled the hallways. Elena read about how the curse started with a student who made a pact with an unknown entity to achieve academic success. The price was their soul, and the curse had haunted the school ever since. Elena left school to go home. She started to feel scared because she was one of the top students at the school. She hadn't witnessed anything herself, so everything seemed vague to her, caught between reality and fiction. As she descended the stairs, the eyes of the portrait seemed to follow her, glowing faintly and eerily in the light. Elena entered the bathroom to splash water on her face, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. She looked up into the mirror and saw a shadowy figure standing behind her. She spun around, but the bathroom was empty. Her breathing became rapid, and she quickly left. Elena sought refuge in the science lab, hoping to find a logical explanation for the strange events. As she flipped through a textbook, the lights flickered and went out. She heard a low growl and saw beakers and test tubes rattling on their own. A cold breeze brushed past her, sending shivers down her spine. Panic. Elena ran down the hallway, her footsteps echoing loudly. She heard whispers of her name, growing louder and more urgent. She stumbled and fell, the whispers now a cacophony of sinister voices. Beware, your turn will come. Desperate, Elena burst into the headmaster's office, hoping to find answers. The office was dark and cluttered with old papers and books. The headmaster's chair slowly turned to reveal a shadowy figure with glowing red eyes. Elena screamed and backed away, tripping over a stack of books. Elena fled the building, her heart pounding. She looked back at the school, which now seemed even more menacing under the moonlight. As Elena ran across the school grounds, she felt a presence chasing her. She reached the gates and looked back one last time. There was a dark shadow peering out from the window. Safe back in her room, Elena tried to calm herself, but the events of the night kept replaying in her mind. She opened her laptop and began writing about the curse, determined to warn others. As she typed, she felt a strange sensation. A shadowy figure lunged towards Elena. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure grabbed her arm, and she was suddenly overwhelmed by a flood of terrifying visions. Students being dragged into darkness, their faces twisted in silent screams, and the entity that started the curse grinning maliciously. Elena saw the student who made the pact, standing before a dark figure with glowing eyes, signing a blood-soaked contract. Elena snapped back to reality, the shadowy figure gone. She was left shivering, a dark mark on her arm where the figure had grabbed her. The screen faded to black, and the only sound was a whisper. Good luck. If you don't leave, you will be next. She didn't know if the curse would follow her, but with such a warning, she decided not to stay another minute. The next day, she left and transferred to a different school. Not long after, the school was abandoned due to rumors, and students gradually left.
Strange clown in the parking lot. It was a chilly October evening in 2016, just a few weeks before Halloween. My friends, Jake and Sarah, and I decided to catch a late-night movie at the local theater. After the movie, which ended around midnight, we lingered in the parking lot, chatting and enjoying the crisp autumn air. The parking lot was mostly empty, illuminated by a few dim streetlights, creating long shadows that danced eerily around us. As we laughed about the horror movie we had just seen, Jake suddenly fell silent, staring behind us. We turned to see a clown standing by an old, beat-up car at the edge of the parking lot. He was dressed in a dirty, oversized clown suit with a red wig and smeared white face paint. Unlike the clowns at birthday parties, this one had a sinister air about him, his smile too wide and his eyes too dark. At first, we thought it was a prank. After all, clown sightings had become a bizarre trend that year. But as he started walking towards us, the playful notion quickly vanished. His movements were slow and deliberate, and in his gloved hand, he held a balloon that bobbed menacingly with each step. Nervously, we decided to head to Jake's car, which was parked a short distance away. We tried to act casual, but our pace quickened with each step. The clown followed, maintaining a steady, unnerving pace. My heart pounded as we reached the car and scrambled inside. Jake fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. Just as we locked the doors, the clown reached the car. He leaned against the driver's side window, his face inches away from Jake's. He pressed the balloon against the glass and slowly dragged his finger down the window, leaving a streak in the condensation. We could see his eyes clearly now, cold and calculating. He tapped on the glass, the sound echoing in the silent parking lot. We were frozen with fear, unsure of what to do next. The clown then moved to the front of the car, standing directly in the headlights. He reached into his oversized pocket and pulled out a long, jagged knife. The sight of the blade sent a fresh wave of panic through us. Jake finally snapped out of his shock and started the car. The engine roared to life, and the clown took a step back, still smiling that unsettling smile. We peeled out of the parking lot, tires screeching, and didn't stop until we were miles away, parked in front of a 24-hour diner. We sat in the car, catching our breath and trying to make sense of what had just happened. We debated calling the police, but without any real harm done, we doubted they'd take us seriously. In the end, we decided to keep the story to ourselves, not wanting to relive the terrifying encounter. To this day, the image of that clown and his menacing smile haunts us. We often wonder what his intentions were and shudder at the thought of what might have happened if we hadn't reached the car in time. The experience left a lasting impression, a chilling reminder that sometimes the scariest encounters are the ones that seem to step straight out of a nightmare.